Hello, everyone. My name is Alison Paprica, and I am a white woman in my late 50s with graying hair and glasses wearing a red shirt. It's my pleasure to be here today to interview Gideon Quaison and Jemal Demeke, both of whom are involved with the EGAP framework. And I'll begin by asking first Gideon and then Jemal to say a little bit about themselves and their connection to the EGAP framework and their roles right now. So Gideon, would you like to go first?
Thank you, Allison. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us. My name is Gideon Quaison, pronouns are he, him. I'm a Black man with a beard, short black hair, wearing glasses and a baby blue t-shirt today. So in terms of my role, I'm a member of the Black Health Equity Working Group. I wear a few different hats, but for the purposes of today's conversation, I've been a member since 2020, and that is kind of when the group initially came together to develop the EGAP framework. You'll hear a lot more about kind of the work that the group has been working on since then and the ways in which the framework has been able to kind of contribute and guide the way we conceptualize and kind of implement health equity data collection within the province and beyond. Excited to be a part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gideon. And Jemal?
Hello everyone. My name is Jemal Demeke, pronouns he, him, they, them. I am a Black man. I got black hair in twists tied back. I'm wearing a red shirt and I also have glasses on. So yes, right now I am a researcher at the Wellesley Institute, where I lead a lot of our research on community data governance and the application of sociodemographic data in our healthcare system. When it comes to EGAP, the EGAP framework specifically, and the Black Health Equity Working Group, I was brought in 2022 to take up the EGAP framework and start to see its implementation within our health system, as well as try and have different conversations with other types of stakeholders outside of health and try and understand what community data governance can look like in those contexts as well. Thank you.
Well, that's great, Jemal. So we've got just a few questions that these folks are going to answer for us. And we're going to begin with asking Jemal if you can briefly describe the EGAP framework for people who are not familiar with it.
So the E, engagement, G, governance, A, access, and P, protections. And so now to describe each of those four a little, the engagement, that first part is describing the importance of having genuine, cyclical, and accessible consultation with communities about data collection, management, analysis, and use. And it's at this point where you could identify what are the priorities for use of health data, right? Whether that can be by the health outcome, so different types of cancers, diabetes, whatever communities in that area finds the most important. But it could also be thinking about the different types of institutions that they feel should be using this data, right? Should the focus be within our emergency departments? Should it be within our community health centers? The answer to these questions, I'm not even going to answer because, again, it will lie within the engagement of the specific communities that you engage. And then you get into that second part of governance. So this is about the actual decision-making abilities that communities should have. So through your engagement processes, once you identify the priorities and approaches that communities feel are responsible, then you want to establish a community governance table. And it's that table that you will go to every time that you need to understand what to do with your data. And then now going into the access part, that's about the right of communities to access their collective data and to determine who has access to it and who shouldn't have access to it, and what's the process to get that. And that ability is actually what provides the power to that community governance table. Otherwise, it's very hard for the community governance table to have any sort of say, right? And that's what this is all about. And then the last piece, the protections, is thinking through, of course, the integrity of the data is incredibly important to communities, and that's part of this is responding to the harms that Black communities have experienced through the extraction of their information. So you want to make sure that the data is protected and held in a way that won't be exploited or sent out to places without the consent of communities.
Thanks a lot, Jemal. That's great. So maybe Gideon, I'll go to you. This is a fantastic product and I think resource for other groups. What was it that prompted the Black Health Equity Working Group to develop this framework in the first place? Where did this come from?
Thanks, Alison. So a few things come to mind. So we know that the legacies of anti-Black racism continue to impact the ways in which Black communities and Black folks experience health across the country, across the province, and globally. So if we can kind of take ourselves back to early 2020, there were signs and indications that a pandemic was arriving and going to have disproportionate impacts across the country and impacting particular population groups. And so the Black Health Equity Working Group is made up of a number of healthcare leaders, Black healthcare leaders that work across the sector in different capacities. And early indications began to describe the ways in which folks were unable to access PPE, were unable to access healthcare institutions, and were unable to access kind of the care that they needed, to be seen in a holistic way. The Black Health Equity Working Group felt the need to kind of create a set of frameworks, a set of principles, develop a stance for us to say, yes, we need to collect health equity data, we need to collect sociodemographic data to be able to understand how this pandemic is impacting our communities disproportionately. But at the same time, we recognize that data can be misused, data can be, repurposed, and data has been used and continues to be used to surveil and disproportionately harm Black communities. So that is kind of the what I would describe a bit of the perfect storm that was brewing at that time back in 2020. And folks within the Black Health Equity Working Group saw a need to create a set of frameworks that were inspired and I would say informed by the OCAP framework, which is, how some folks within the Indigenous and First Nation communities have also been conceptualizing and thinking about data sovereignty and data governance to create a bit of a framework to support our communities and our needs at that time. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that sort of origin story. And it really, I think, underscores why access and control of access is so important, given some of the concerns that were there from the outset. Maybe, Gideon, could you say a little bit more in case people, which I fully hope they do, they look up the EGAP framework and they look at it. If they wanted to develop their own data governance framework, the people coming to the conference, can you say a little bit about the process?
Yeah, so I would say a lengthy one. It was a good process, but definitely a lengthy one. I think when we think about EGAP being a framework that speaks on behalf of the Black community, we need to also recognize the diversity in opinions, the diversity in thoughts, the diversities in kind of how different folks within the system and outside of the system are conceptualizing data governance and data sovereignty, right? So I think a huge part of the EGAP process was finding ways to connect with folks who might not fit in the traditional silos or sectors that we've carved out in healthcare and health institutions, health systems, public health, and really ensuring that we created a tool that was, one, accessible in all of the different ways, but two, also reflected the diversity in opinions, right? So I think one of the things that EGAP does not shy away from is recognizing that there are many folks who are for data collection, but there are many folks who have very valid concerns about the ways in which data is currently being used to cause more harm than good, right? So I think a part of that EGAP process was identifying the right folks within community, the right folks within the healthcare institution to be able to gather that information and understand kind of the varying opinions and varying perspectives that are going into a framework that is supposed to kind of capture, a lot of thoughts and opinions within the Black community. The other thing I would say is that I think in its essence, EGAP, OCAP, a lot of these other data governance frameworks look to do, a few core things. And I think in its essence, they look to essentially protect, they look to essentially ensure that folks within particular communities are able to, experience happy and healthy lives, they look to essentially be able to, create a bit of a legacy and a process and a lineage for how research and data collection should be done in particular community groups. And often within community groups where historically we've seen, the extraction of their data not being used to benefit those communities. So I think there will be, differences across cultures, differences across ethnicities, differences within different regions, depending on the context. But in its essence, I think any data governance framework should recognize that, first and foremost, it is for the people. And I think sometimes when we talk about data, folks get rearranged into numbers and percentages and statistics. But I think, any framework that does not, recognize the humanity of folks, does not demonstrate empathy, does not demonstrate care, is not a framework that will actually kind of meet the needs of what these, frameworks centered around sovereignty and governance aim to do.
Yeah, I hear you. And at least be a step towards addressing historical injustices too, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, our last question is about implementation. So you've got this great document, this great framework and set of principles. Any advice you have to share about putting it into practice in different regions and organizations? And Jemal, let's start with you on this.
Yeah, I have some great insights on this based on, when we followed a few different healthcare organizations try and put EGAP into place. And there were three areas of focus that, I realized would be really important for the spread of EGAP. So getting organizational readiness, focusing on your data infrastructure, and then making sure that you create some really, creative partnerships. And to go into each of those three a bit, the first one, the readiness piece, you need to make sure that within your organization that do you feel that you have the culture that both values data, right? The use of data, and then also equity. So this could be within the different roles, right? Having one department or one team that focuses on equity is not enough. What you need to ensure is that across the different areas that you have, some formal and informal connections across your human resources, organizational development, whether it's leadership, analysts, all of those types, that equity is embedded into the strategic plans or focus areas for all of those different departments and teams. And another part is also trying to embed race-based data and community data governance within the strategies that are already happening, right? Are you focusing on, if there's a new booster shot and you're trying to get more COVID, vaccines in people's arms, are you already trying to collect data around that? Well, this is one place where you would want to, put in race-based data and then also then think about how that EGAP could be reflected there. So it's about normalizing it into the context that already exists within the organization. So again, the objectives, whether that's at the board of directors level, which is pretty important. It's important to make sure that leadership at the most high level understands what EGAP is and also, again, prioritizes it through the ways that they already prioritize all their other initiatives, right? Because we want to ensure that resources are put that way. Going into that second point I mentioned, want to think about the data infrastructure. So there's already technologies that are in place at most, healthcare systems, whether that's an EMR or human resources management system, something along the lines to use to track people. But then we also want to think about how differently we would want to approach race-based data, because again, the part is we don't want everyone to have access to it. Just because you are a healthcare professional, just because you work in the human resources team, does not necessarily mean that you have the right to access race-based data for everyone. And so it's about investigating based on the technologies that you have available, do you have the capabilities to have those controls? And if not, then you may want to think about branching out and going into, thinking about third parties that you might be able to, make specific agreements with to collect and house that data. And in those agreements, you'll say, well, you can only, provide this information with these requirements in place. And in that way, it's not necessarily going to be part of the system if you don't feel that the system is ready to handle it. And then you also want to ensure that, in addition to earlier when I was talking about the teams that, should be aware of EGAP and equity as a whole, You also want to go specifically into your data scientists, data analysts, your data coordinators, quality improvement and evaluation teams. All of them should be engaged critically in this process. I think often we think that the equity teams should be the lead of these things and do it on their own, when really most equity teams, their role is to strengthen the capacity and support other teams. And so what the ownership of this of these initiatives of EGAP should not be on an EDI specialist, but really on the data specialists. So again, it's about thinking about your data infrastructure in a way that eventually it's going to support community data governance. And lastly, that last piece is thinking about collaborative partnerships that revolve around EGAP. So there's different levels to it. There's internally, we often see that people come together anyway, usually off the sides of their desk, to try and organize around initiatives, usually around EGAP. And we want to stop seeing that. We love the effort, but we need organizations to invest the time and set up actual spaces to focus on EGAP, ones where leadership are actually involved, and not necessarily people that are just passionate about it. While we think these people deserve to be a part of these spaces, and they usually have the knowledge, that organizations are seeking around equity and the lenses, we need that to actually be valued in time, and then also be allocated both the resources and support to make sure that that work goes forward. So about those internal collaborations and engagement. We also want to think externally. Organizations don't exist as a silo. Hospitals usually talk with other hospitals, and CHCs with other CHCs, and sometimes hospitals, different spaces talk to each other too. We want to ensure that as a sector, that there are also spaces for conversations to be moved forward, so that it also builds a communal accountability, right, across the different institutions, so that there's an awareness that this is being taken up and taken seriously as a unit, right, as a health system. That's essentially what's important. And then we also, of course, want to make sure that the partnerships with community, right, communities, patients, and community organizations also in data governance. And so we want to see that pushed forward, where you're going to have those engagement events. So all in all, again, to summarize, it's about thinking about the organizational readiness. It's about thinking about your data infrastructure, thinking about the different partnerships and engagement.
Well, that's great. And what I'm hearing is really practical advice. And really, again, folks, I'm just so impressed with this. Closing words.
I think, the purpose of data is to inform action. So if we are collecting this information, if we are quantifying, lived experiences, if we are reporting statistics, and on the other end, there are no policies, there are no programs, there are no services, there are no changes to the material conditions of the communities being disproportionately harmed by, whether it's within the system, whether it's a pandemic, we have then failed as a healthcare system, right? So I don't want folks to get only situated on the data collection piece, but recognizing that we need to collect data to be able to inform how we change, how we deliver healthcare, how we, support communities, and how we respond to folks in need, right? So the underlying thread should be action. The collection of this data does another piece, which is holds the system accountable to change, right? Holds the system accountable to the needs of community and holds the system accountable to the needs of the broader population. So I want folks to walk away with two A's within this conversation, which is action and accountability. And I hope they hold those two pieces dear.
It's going to be challenging to try and convince communities to provide their information to institutions that they don't trust, unless we provide the ability for those communities to be involved in what's going to happen with that data, with that information, right? And so part of what governance is to support institutions in the commitments that they have already made or having to make very soon.
Thank you so much, Jemal and Gideon, for those closing thoughts. I'm going to end the interview by displaying a quotation from the Black Health Equity Working Group that Gideon suggested we present at the end. Though we don't have time to read it aloud, we've included the full text in the transcript. And I think it's a really fitting way to end the interview because it emphasizes that data has real-world implications for Black communities. and that the EGAP framework is not meant to be the final iteration or answer, but rather a tool in a lineage of advocacy and resistance aimed at affirming, uplifting, and centering on Black lives. I do hope you've learned, as I have from this interview, and that you consult the EGAP framework to learn even more.